The following webinar is presented by the E-Extension Farm Energy Community of Practice at extension.org and the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is John Hay with the University of Nebraska, and welcome to today's Bioenergy Friday web seminar. We have a very timely topic today with Bruce Babcock from Iowa State University. Bruce is the Cargill Endowed Chair for Energy Economics and is a professor of economics there at Iowa State University. Today he's going to talk about anticipated impacts of RFS 2014 volumes on corn and soybean prices. And this is very timely as we are waiting with bated breath to find out what the EPA is going to say about the 2014 volumes. And we know that there's potential for any number of different impacts that could be. And Dr. Babcock is going to talk about a number of those today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce Babcock. Welcome, Bruce.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to come and talk today about the renewable fuel standard. It's been in the news lately a lot, and I think it's been on. In fact, some of you might have heard about it through robocalls from the petroleum industry, trying to drum up support for modification of the RFS, so it's a big issue right now about the impacts of the RFS in both farm country, but also in terms of the future of biofuels. So what I hope to do today is try to explore a bit about the decision that EPA is making and to try to bring it down to a bit of both short-term and long-term impacts on the agricultural sector and rural areas in general. So to get started, I thought we should just make sure that all of us are familiar with what is the RFS, and it's the Renewable Fuel Standard, and it's the regulations that are put out by the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the agency that implements the federal law, and it's designed to increase biofuel consumption to replace fossil fuel consumption at its basic level. And I think it's important when we're thinking about the future of the RFS to actually figure out what it is that it was supposed to accomplish. Its most recent version was passed in 2007 when we were at the height of the Iraq war that wasn't going very well at all. We had lots of expenses and lots of troops, lots of death, and the Bush administration really was looking for some way to assure the U.S. public that maybe we wouldn't have to go through this again. So the reason why this RFS was passed in 2007, the political momentum, really was energy security and trying to increase the production of domestic fuel to reduce our imported oil. So that, I think, was the political reason why it passed. But also other reasons why it passed was the environmental community got behind it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by using renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. And always there is that rural economic development was a big reason because most of the feedstock sources and biorefineries are located in rural areas, and so you have increased rural economic activity. So these are the three main objectives. Now, if you go up to the top bullet point there, you can see that these objectives are going to be met by substituting renewable fuel for fossil fuel. So immediately you see a conflict from the oil companies that are in the business of producing fossil fuels, fossil gasoline. So to achieve the objectives, essentially, you have to take market share away from oil industry. And so you can see why they might object to implementation of the RFS, and so that's kind of leading to where we are today. So just to review a little bit about how successful, we've been, the U.S. produces about 1 million barrels per day of biofuels in terms of equivalent crude oil. That's about the same as the Bakken field in North Dakota, which has been really celebrated for reducing our oil imports from, and so you can see that the biofuels and the Bakken field are about equal in terms of their contribution to substituting domestically produced energy from imported energy. It's clearly also helped foster unprecedented profitability for crop farmers, which has trickled down into more economic activity in rural areas. And really we've seen the last 7 years as profitable of an agricultural sector as we've ever seen. It has also fostered lots of investment in technology development in terms of making the existing corn ethanol plants more efficient, but also we're seeing new investments in second-generation biofuels in plants. So it has also done that. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the more efficient corn ethanol plants really reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 50% relative to gasoline, and biodiesel from different feedstocks reduces greenhouse gas emissions by more. So essentially, it's fairly odd, I think, for a federal policy to actually achieve its objectives. And I think that there's an argument that can be made that this policy actually has achieved its objectives. So what's the issue if it's achieved its objective? Well, right now, the amount of ethanol that is blended in the U.S. gasoline supply is almost 10%. It's and that's an E10 or 10% ethanol blends. It's actually about 9.7, 9.8% because there's still a small percentage of E0 that's sold in the United States. But for all intents and purposes, almost every gallon of gasoline sold in the United States has 10% ethanol in it. But the ethanol mandates starting in 2014 really are slated to move beyond the E10 level. Now, E10 is easy to achieve because all U.S. cars are manufactured and certified to run on E10. If you go beyond E10, you can do so, but it takes either a flex fuel vehicle using E85, or you can use E15 or 15% ethanol. And the Environmental Protection Agency says model year 2001 and later cars can use E15, but the automobile manufacturer says, well, EPA may say that, but our cars were not certified and are not built to run on E15. And so GM has certified their cars model years 2012 and after. Ford is 2013. Toyota and others are starting, some of them in 2014, to certify their cars. So there's a real battle going on between the acceptability of E15 in the marketplace in terms of use in the cars. And so there is some hesitation to go beyond. So E10. So really, E10 is kind of at a break point, if you will, in terms of the amount of ethanol that can actually be consumed in the marketplace. So a little bit about the politics and economics. I've alluded to that, and it's pretty clear that the oil industry does not want mandates to increase further. There's two reasons for that. The first reason is that, as I indicated earlier, any further increase in ethanol consumption takes away their market, and they simply are fighting for market share. But a second reason, a little more subtle, is that they've learned to make a lot of money on E10. Ethanol provides a fuel extender in terms of you can run your car on the BTUs in ethanol, but probably more importantly, the octane that is provided by ethanol, which is a high octane fuel, allows the oil refineries to put out low octane gasoline, an 84 to 85 octane blend stock that then, when topped off with 10% ethanol, makes 87 octane regular gasoline. And because ethanol has been selling for a lot less than gasoline, and they can save money by producing low octane gasoline, ethanol is making the oil companies a lot of money as long as it stays at E10. So from their perspective, they're at a real sweet spot. So what they've done is joined forces with livestock groups and funded a very heavy campaign to lobby to kill the RFS, or to, short of repealing the RFS, to get EPA to reduce the mandates to keep them at the E10 level. And some of you might have seen some of the campaign that they were doing. So their main public argument is that E85 is a failed fuel. Consumers don't want it. The vehicles aren't there. The gas stations aren't there. E15 will ruin your engine. More ethanol will cause food prices to soar. And if mandates, the ultimate threat that they use is if mandates increase, the only way they can comply with increased mandates is to cut the gasoline to U.S. consumers, thereby causing economic ruin. And you might think that I'm engaging in a bit of hyperbole here, but in fact I'm saying almost wrote what their campaign is. And I just came from a meeting in Washington, which is trying to find some middle ground on this RFS, and the oil industry is sticking to this campaign, and even in behind closed doors. So this really is their belief. And some of you might have seen I just thought I would share a little bit about this. There's commercials on television that are doing this. There's robocalls, and there's print ads. So here's a poor guy that's in the repair shop because of higher ethanol caused some problem with his engine. Here's a lady broken down on the side of the road, caused by E15 and engine damage, and she's blaming ethanol. So call your congressman or a tow truck operator. And so it's really a fear campaign. And then the livestock industry gets into it a bit, and it's not all the livestock industry, but a big portion of it. And talking about how food versus fuel is causing livestock prices to increase dramatically. Of course, those who follow the livestock industry know that livestock prices have increased dramatically real recently. At the same time, corn prices have been coming down, primarily because of a big drought in Texas cut the cattle herd, and big export demand for U.S. pork has increased pork prices substantially. So anyway, I thought I would share that with you to show what is going on, in case you haven't heard it a bit. So why did the petroleum industry and livestock groups really start to join forces now? Well, the reason is that 2014 is actually the first year in which mandates were slated to rise above levels that can be met with 10% ethanol blends. If you think that 13 billion gallons is needed to put 10% ethanol in every gallon, that's E10. The mandates were supposed to go to 14.4 billion gallons in 2014 and 15 billion gallons in 2015. Up until now, we've been able to meet the mandates by blending in E10 and the use of carryover credits from excess blending in previous years. But 2014 was the first year when we wouldn't have enough excess carryover credits, so that in fact we were going to have to blend more ethanol in the gasoline supply than E10. And so the oil industry, I think, really thinks that this is their last year, that they better stop it now. And basically, the oil industry really believes is arguing anyway, that compliance with the RFS will ruin the U.S. economy, and compliance is physically impossible after 2015 without ruining the economy. So what happened? Well, this big campaign was successful. The EPA has proposed in a proposal that was leaked in August, so we've known it since August, but the EPA has proposed to reduce ethanol mandates to 13 billion gallons. That proposal was a proposed rule made in November by the Environmental Protection Agency. The stated reason is the number of E85 and E15 fueling stations is not sufficient to allow consumption to exceed 13 billion gallons. It's a clear victory for the oil industry, and the final rules will be issued after a public comment period that I say we're in right now. It just ended. I heard a presentation by EPA last week at the National Ethanol Conference that June 20th is when, or the end of June, actually he said springtime, and he said they will issue their final rule, and Chris Grundler from EPA said, and I know that spring ends on June 20th. So they're really targeting June 20th to release the final rules. There's been some hints that EPA is going to back off this proposed rule, but we'll have to just wait and see what happens. So what's at stake? So finally, after that introduction, I'm going to get to the point of the title of the talk. So what I've graphed here is the monthly corn prices since 2006. I thought this would give a nice historical view as to what's happened to corn prices. And you can see that we had record high corn prices. This is the monthly corn price received by farmers in the United States. And so you can see we had record high corn prices in May 2008 that corresponded with the sharp run-up in crude oil prices that occurred in the spring of 2008. Then we had the Great Recession, took the top right off the corn prices. But then we see that the corn prices marched straight back up and hit record levels due to the drought of 2012. And now they've fallen, as you can see, a lot, and they seem to have stabilized at something more than $4. So that's kind of the where we've been with corn prices. And if you want to understand why those corn prices went so high, let me go back a little bit. Why they went so high in the 2012-2011 period. We can look at a scatter diagram of scatter plot of the actual corn yields from 1990 to 2013. Then if I fit a trend line that all of us were believing was the future, those of us who follow corn. So if I fit a trend line that was estimated from data from 1990 to 2010, you can see that people were expecting U.S. corn yields to go through 160 and then keep going up. So you can see that we've actually had, based on that old trend line, you see that we've had 4 years in a row of below trend yields in the United States. So our acreage has gone up a lot, but our yields have not kept up with what we thought was a new renaissance in corn yields. But I think that renaissance in corn yields was dependent on good growing conditions. We simply haven't had good growing conditions. So what I thought I would do is say, okay, well, let's fit a new trend line to it. Well, there's a new trend line if we take the, apologize for the misspelled word there, but if you take the new trend line that runs from 1990 to 2013, you can see that, in fact, that good weather really boosted trend yields higher than we probably should expect. So, but even so, we had the 2011 and 2012 corn crops were below trend yields, and then if you fit the new trend line, last year's yield was at trend line. So we haven't had good growing conditions, which is the primary reason we've had high corn prices. Here's the soybean prices, and the story's similar, but soybean prices have been ramping up more steadily than corn prices. They've been less boom and bust than corn prices, and soybean prices have been driven primarily by soybean meal prices and big demand for protein in Asia and around the world, and so that's keeping soybean prices high. But you still see some moderation in soybean prices, and again, you can see just sitting trend yields that we've had 3 years in a row where trend yields in the United States have not kept up. So what I wanted to do is calculate a little bit about the. So what I've tried to do here is explain a bit why corn prices have been and soybean prices have been so high. It's been good demand combined with poor yields in the United States, and sometimes poor yields around the country, around the world, which has kept soybean and corn prices high. So how important is the RFS to corn and soybean prices? Again, getting right at the point of the title of my talk. So I think there's no doubt that the oil companies, even if the RFS is repealed, like ethanol. But they only like it at an E10 level because they make a lot of money off of ethanol at E10. So I think that it's likely that we're going to have 12 to 13 billion gallons, and I wrote 13 billion gallons here, of corn ethanol is going to be produced in the United States, even if the RFS is repealed. Now, at most 15 billion gallons is going to be produced for the next few years, because that's the capacity of the corn ethanol industry in the United States, is about 15 billion gallons. So essentially, the RFS can either push consumption and production to 15, or consumption and production will fall to 13. So there's about 2 billion gallons that are at stake of corn ethanol in terms of what might happen to corn demand. For biodiesel, what I'm doing is a worst case and best case scenario for biodiesel. I think if you completely got rid of the RFS, the worst case scenario is that no gallons of biodiesel would be produced from soybean oil. There would still be biodiesel produced from lower cost feedstocks, including waste grease, corn oil extracted from ethanol plants, and tallow and animal fats. And at most, I think we would have 1.1 billion gallons of biodiesel produced from soybean oil. So this slide, I'm just trying to give an idea of what's at stake perhaps for demand for corn and soybeans from the RFS. So about 2 billion gallons of corn ethanol and about 1.1 billion gallons of biodiesel made from soybean oil. And probably the 1.1 billion gallons overstates the range, but I just wanted to, kind of create some scenarios here. So if you look at the direct effects on feedstock demand from this range, so if you think about 2 billion gallons of corn ethanol, that's about 500 million bushels of net corn. When I say net corn, I'm taking into account the value of distillers grains in the feeds system from the production of ethanol. As you can see, you don't get 4 gallons of corn ethanol per bushel of corn processed. You get about 2.8 gallons, but you get about almost 4 gallons of ethanol per net bushel of corn when you take into account the distillers grains that go back into the feed market, displacing some of the corn that was taken out. That 500 million bushels is about almost 4% of projected demand. And so if you think about a worst case to best case scenario, you're really talking about 4% of demand. And if you think about what that means, and you use how a change in demand would affect the price, you're really thinking about a 7.5% potential swing in market prices for corn, just due to that 2 billion gallons of potential swing in ethanol demand. And if you got 450 corn, that's about 34 cents per bushel potential change in price. So the potential demand by ethanol plants for corn does have an effect on the corn price, but it's not like driving it to $3 per bushel or $6 per bushel. It's really in the $4, remains in the $4 range, plus or minus 34 cents a bushel on with regards to corn prices. Now, I know that you think, well, this is pretty back of the envelope, but that's correct. But if your model that I'm going to present a little bit later doesn't agree with back of the envelope calculations, it's probably because the model's wrong. So this is a reality check. Do the same thing for feedstock demand on soybean oil, and I see a typo here. 1.1 billion gallons of biodiesel is about 8.25 billion pounds of soybean oil, not million pounds, billion pounds of soybean oil. That would increase USDA projected demand for soybean oil by about 15%. 15% increase in demand would increase price by about 20%, or about 7 cents per pound. So you can follow my arithmetic here. So I basically kind of conclude that the maximum effect of the RFS is a swing of about $1 per bushel of soybeans, plus or minus either way. And if you think about $13 soybeans, $12 soybeans, $1 out of that is less than 10%, 8% to 6%. Somewhere in that price range is the potential impact of the RFS on soybean prices. But the actual effects will be smaller than that. That's the direct effect. Because if you get a change of price, either an increase or a decrease, you'll get a change in acreage, which will compensate somewhat for the change in price. For example, an increase in price, let's say the RFS just goes full out, corn prices go up a little bit, you'll get higher acreage than you otherwise would have, you get higher production, and the net result will be a lower price effect than anticipated. Similarly, if you get a reduction in a price, the acreage will go down, and the price will be higher than you would have anticipated due to the supply response. So there's some attenuation of the effects that of the potential effects from the RFS. For ethanol, the export demand also needs to be taken into account. Export demand is really strong, so it's very unlikely that ethanol production will fall to 13 billion gallons. I anticipate it's going to be between 14 and 15 billion gallons, with or without the RFS and changes that the EPA proposed, simply because ethanol is a good fuel to export. So what I basically did is I promised that I would actually run through this in a formal model, and I have a nice formal model that projects out corn prices. And so what I did was I looked at my projection for corn prices with a full RFS, which increases corn ethanol consumption to 15 billion gallons, versus EPA holding back the RFS to 13 billion gallons. And you can see the blue line is the full RFS. The 13 billion gallons is the EPA proposed rule, and keeping it at E10. And you can see that I'm projecting a price effect of about, if I do my arithmetic right, 25 to 30 cents per bushel on corn from that from those two scenarios. And in this model, I do take into account the effect of acreage changes. So think about ethanol exports. So right now, gasoline futures prices are about at $3 a gallon. Ethanol cost of production is less than $2 a gallon. Think about the demand for ethanol at $2 versus gasoline at $3. So gasoline importers have a strong incentive to substitute ethanol for gasoline imports. The octane value also creates value. So even if EPA says domestic consumption won't exceed 13 billion gallons, the ethanol plants are going to run higher levels of production, and the surplus will be exported. I think there's no doubt about that. So the price effects that I projected in this model will be lower than I'm projecting here. So for corn anyway, the RFS, in the short run anyway, doesn't have all that much effect as long as export markets are open. But the longer run, I think, for agriculture, we have a longer run concern in rural areas should have a concern, is that the EPA proposed rule really creates a precedent for E10. That is that EPA is arguing that they can't expand the RFS because the infrastructure is not there. But the problem is that the infrastructure to increase blending won't really get built because the oil company doesn't want it built, and because so it won't get built unless EPA forces it to get built by expanding mandates. So by EPA saying, well, we can't expand the mandates, the RFS volumes, until the infrastructure gets built. Well, it'll never get built because unless EPA forces it to get built, it just won't get built. So the future of the advanced ethanol industry, those new plants that are coming online and a potential future industry that's trying to take cellulosic materials and create ethanol out of it, they don't want to play a what I call a shrinking negative sum game with corn ethanol. That is, the EPA precedent, and you see political movements in Congress right now trying to basically keep everything at E10. So if you were to get advanced ethanol to come online, the only room for it would be created by a cut in corn ethanol. So I think that that's a longer run concern. And I think to avoid this, the EPA really does need to push beyond E10 with the RFS. Otherwise, I think we can pretty much kiss that budding industry, the cellulosic ethanol, advanced ethanol industry, goodbye in the United States. And so it is budding. I thought I'd show you a picture for those of you who aren't around central Iowa or north central Iowa. These stacks of corn stover have been sprouting everywhere around the DuPont plant and around the Poet plant up in Emmitsburg. And so this is a stack of corn stover that is being collected by DuPont cellulosic ethanol. So this cellulosic ethanol is a reality now. It's not 5 years away. The plant should be start operation, or at least being commissioned later this year, and the Poet DSM plant in Emmitsburg should start operating this year. When I said a shrinking sum game, I'm really saying is if you look at U.S. gasoline consumption, it has been shrinking since 2007, where it reached a peak. And the projections are because of the increased miles per gallon standards that the Obama administration has passed, that U.S. gasoline demand will continue to shrink into the future. So if you think about an ethanol industry that is stuck at E10 because the EPA has decided that E10 is as far as we can go, and then your gasoline consumption is falling, that means that your E10, the amount of ethanol you need to blend into a shrinking gasoline consumption level, will be shrinking as well. That's why I call it a shrinking zero-sum game for ethanol if the EPA decision holds forth. So the question is, and I'm going to end with just a few slides here, and then we can take some questions, is how is it possible? Is the oil industry right to assume that we can't break through the E10 blend wall because of the problems with E15 in terms of automobile compatibility or the lack of demand for E85? So what I did is I did some research on where the potential demand for E85. And the first thing we did is found out where the E85 stations are located, where the fuel is sold. And it's sold, throughout the country, but there's very few stations except in the upper Midwest. You can see that they're mainly concentrated in Minnesota, and then there's some in the Chicago area, and Detroit areas, but primarily E85 is sold in the primary Midwest, primarily in the upper Midwest. And if you look at where the concentration of flex fuel vehicles are, you can actually see that they're down in the wherever major metropolitan areas are. Right now, this is a little bit old data. I think we have about 16 to 17 million flex vehicles out there in the vehicle fleet. And the problem, of course, is to try to match the flex vehicles with the E85 and to price it right. So you can see here that so what we did is we matched every flex vehicle to see how far they would have to drive to an E85 pump, and then said, well, if you priced it right, how much E85 would people buy? So if you have no further investment in E85 fueling infrastructure, we calculate if you price E85 to make sense, to make save consumers some money filling up with E85, and let's say that you priced ethanol at $2, that you could consume somewhere between 13.5 and about 13.8 billion gallons. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of ethanol, so about 500 to 700 million extra gallons of ethanol. But you got to remember that the blend wall at 13 is supposed to be an immutable barrier. But in fact, we found that if you just take the existing infrastructure and you push the mandates a bit beyond E15, you push the mandates a bit beyond E10, that in fact you can break through that blend wall with the existing locations of the FFVs and the existing infrastructure. And if you did that and started pricing E85 so that it saved consumers money and made retail outlets a bit of money, then what would happen is that you would find that you would increase the interest in investing in E85. So then we calculated, well, where would that investment take place? Well, it makes sense to put the E85 stations where the flex vehicles are. And so what would happen if you invested in 2,500 new stations or 5,000 new stations or 7,500 new stations, and you priced E85 at parity with gasoline, then you can see as you increase the number of stations, see if I got that. If you increase the number of stations to 2,500 to 5,000 to 7,500, you could break through and increase ethanol consumption above 15 billion gallons. And that's beyond what the U.S. ethanol industry can make. So it's really up to the EPA to decide if they want to break through that blend wall by increasing the mandates or not. The oil industry simply is not correct that it says it's an immutable blend wall. And so essentially this shows the importance, especially if we want to expand second generation ethanol, they're going to need some room to sell that. And the only room that they will have, unless they're going to reduce corn ethanol market share, which they don't want to do in terms of a shrinking zero-sum game, the EPA is going to have to break through the blend wall through the RFS. Otherwise, I think the future is kind of bleak. So I think that's the longer run impact of what we're talking about. So I think the last slide I have here is how do you get E85 priced right? Well, you can either get very expensive gasoline, so high crude oil prices. We have that. It's $100 a barrel for crude oil. Or you can have cheap ethanol. Well, we're getting there with cheaper corn. If we finally get some good growing conditions in the Corn Belt, and if acreage stays up this year, we're going to be a lot of corn washing around. And so I think next year after this harvest, if we get good growing conditions, that will be we will have cheap ethanol. And you actually have the RFS. If EPA decides that they can increase blending, what you'll have is that the market for RINs, and I don't want to go too much into this, but there's a policy mechanism in place to make E85 inexpensive.
This webinar has been brought to you by the Farm Energy Community of Practice and the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension. For more information, go to farmenergymedia.extension.org.